Yes, I've been so bored during this quarantine that I have made a TikTok account. Anyways, this video, I want to talk about Pavel Tsatsouline. I think that's how you pronounce it, but he was on Joe Rogan, and this particular clip, it's like a 26-minute long video. You should definitely watch it. I will link that in the description. But he basically talks about the Soviet weightlifting methodology and why it was so successful and so important to training as we know it. They were the first to really record empirical data around training. And I mean lots and lots of data.
So typical strength training study is what? 6 weeks for some untrained college subjects. You know, guys who are just on their phones. Professor Medvedev, who's also a world champion, he studied the training loads of top weightlifters only when they were successful in competition for 4 Olympic cycles. 4. So we're talking about 16 years, and then somebody else did it for another cycle.
So in this way, the Soviets are kind of like the Beatles of strength training.
We're going to see a doctor about that.
They really started it all, and they can be attributed to a lot of the modern techniques that we use today. The first thing that Pavel talks about is Milo, and a lot of people use this example of Milo carrying his calf up the hill.
Progressive overload is usually explained as this legend of Milo of Crotona. So this guy started carrying a little calf on his shoulders, and he would carry the calf every day. So the calf would grow, and eventually the guy became very strong. So that's why that name is present in the strength game.
It's a great way to explain through some sort of mythology progressive overload, and in a very very small increments that you can get stronger and stronger as long as you repeat the same thing pretty much daily and increase load. And this is a very small description of progressive overload, but he didn't want to dive too much into progressive overload. The main thing that he said, and I really like this.
In nature, most changes are discrete. They're not gradual.
And that's sort of stuck with me. Adaptations in nature aren't always going to be gradual. Something that maybe it's very slow over time we can't see, but it doesn't always have a perfectly upward trajectory. The first thing that Pavel talks about is step loading, and he compares it to wave loading. So step loading would be essentially taking a load and lifting it the same way, the same amount of reps, all of these things over the course of 2-3 weeks, and then taking a bigger jump into kind of seeing what you can do. Maybe you go 75%, 75%, 75%, and then you say, all right, let's max out, let's see what we can do. Rather than wave loading, which would say lift 75%, 80%, 85%, then we're gonna take a slight deload, and then we'll see what we're gonna do. Step loading is across, wave loading goes up. Pretty simple to determine the differences between those, but the efficacy of step loading is sometimes more valuable than the efficacy of wave loading. And he compares these two things to some of the old school weightlifting techniques of the Soviets compared to the more modern techniques of the American powerlifters. He keeps referring to guys like Eddie Cohen and guys in that era of lifting, which is kind of the golden era of powerlifting. However, I would say that currently we're on a pretty good hot streak with powerlifters.
So the classic American powerlifting training template, this is cycling. So the history of cycling is very interesting. Again, what cycling is? Cycling is, in the simplest possible terms, you take 12 weeks, you start with light weights, you build up until you go really heavy. And that was the predominant strength training system in the 70s, in the 80s. And that was the strength system behind the dominant American powerlifting team.
The reason why step loading is kind of a hard one to want to do if you're training is because, like Pavel says,
first of all, it weeds out the impatient people.
With step loading, what the Soviets would say,
so it takes time for things to really get solidified.
the progressive overload is not in your face. It's not week to week. You don't go from 75% to 80% to 85%. You stay away from the expedience of knowing that you're getting better. It's a very stoic approach to training, and it really does lend itself to the kind of Soviet ideals of training. Then he sort of dives into variable loading, which to me, he doesn't really explain it that well because it's really hard to explain and it's hard to understand if you think about it in exact steps and exact things that we need to know. To my knowledge, that kind of seems like it's more of a specific program dedicated to a very specific person, and it's from someone who is in the room changing and adapting and, most importantly, auto-regulating. I really do believe that auto-regulation lends itself to a variable program and variable loading, and they're one and the same. If adaptations are discrete, well then so is recovery, depending on the size of the athlete, the athlete's fitness, all of these other factors. They're very, very hard to manage. So what you can do is think about undulating your weekly protocol and then adding in novelty. If someone snatches heavy from the floor, let's say it's Lasha Talkhadze, he's snatching heavy from the floor. That means he has to lift over 200 kilos, right? That's a heavy session for him. What if we want to work on snatching again, but he's thrashed because he just did 200? So, we're 2 days later and we want him to make the best of this. We don't want him to lift too light and mess with his head like, oh my God, this 180 kilo snatch feels so heavy compared to 200 like what I did on Monday. No, what we can do is we can add novelty. We can do no foot snatches. We can do snatches from the hang. We can do things from the blocks. And from there we can alter the load and all of these different things. But these are things that are very hard to plan out ahead of time. But where am I going with all of this? And this is kind of how I want to narrow it down. When I was getting back into shape recently, I just made a video about general physical preparedness. Check it out if you haven't seen that one yet. And I took a break from weightlifting, focused on general qualities of fitness, and my total went down. And so when I came back to training weightlifting, I'd say my snatch was at 115 kilos and my clean and jerk was at maybe 150. That means that my working loads were anywhere from 100 to 105 kilos in the snatch and 125 to 140 in the clean and jerk. Those are very low, right? For someone that has snatched 143 and someone who's clean and jerked 176, those are very low numbers. But my goal across all of those weeks was to take those loads and make them feel easier over time. It wasn't just to think, okay, my maximum lift right now is 115. I want my maximum lift to be 120. I want my maximum lift to be 125. No, my goal was to say, okay, 100 to 105 kilo snatches feels like this right now. Next week, I want it to feel easier. The week after that, I want to be able to do more reps at it and I want it to feel super easy. The week after that, I want it to feel like I'm doing nothing. Okay, then I can focus on my maximums. I like to think of this as kind of like an inchworm effect, right? I take my minimums, I move them up, I move the quality up, then I can start moving my maximums. In between this spot right here would be that bell curve where the loads are situated.
You will see that about half of all the lifts that you do are about 75-80%. Now, where do all the other lifts come in? So there's a normal distribution. So you'll find that 75-80% are on the top, 80-85 a little bit lower, So the lighter weights, like 60%, are on the bottom. And the heavy weights, like 90% and higher, are on the bottom as well.
The most important thing is knowing that conceptually, you don't need a pattern, right? Just like Pavel said, it's discrete. That means the pattern will come at you randomly. It won't just be progressive overload, detrain, progressive overload, detrain. Things are gonna happen that you can't control. There are so many goddamn variables. That's why it's important to auto-regulate, to know what you've done on Monday so that on Wednesday when you want to snatch again, you can do a variable, at least have a reason for it. And the main thing that I can draw from this is focus on your minimums. If 90 kilos in the snatch moves a certain way, say it moves really well, can you make 95 kilos move the same way next week or the week after that or 4 weeks from now, whatever that means? Rather than focusing on what is the max number you think you could hit, try to hit your minimums in a better way. So I know that's a really broad conceptual idea on this, and I want to start a conversation in the comments. So if you have questions, I'll try to answer them the best I can in the comments section. But beyond that, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.